We've already covered from 1 to 10 the Bill of Rights. Let's review the amending process for a minute. You know that amending the Constitution is a two-step process. You first have to propose an amendment, and then you have to ratify it. To propose an amendment takes 2/3 of both houses of Congress, and then you have to have 3/4 of the states to okay the changes to the Constitution, the amendments. Another way would be to call a convention and have 2/3 of the states in a convention agree to a change, and then 3/4 of the states to agree to actually make the change in the Constitution. Now, the 11th Amendment to the Constitution put limits on the federal courts. That's what it was designed for. People were afraid that the states would be taken advantage of in the federal courts. So it was to protect the states from the federal courts, from people going into the federal court and suing a state, or people coming from a foreign country and suing a state. So you cannot use the U.S. courts to sue states. You can't sue a state in a federal court. You can't sue California unless they agree to be sued. And people from foreign countries cannot sue a state in a federal court. The 12th Amendment is about choosing the president and the vice president. Originally, the president and the vice president were chosen separately. So what that meant was the person who got the most votes, and they were electoral votes, became president. The second person with the second most votes became vice president. Well, the first election after Washington, you ended up with John Adams as president and Thomas Jefferson as vice president, and they didn't agree on policy. So it was not a good situation. So the president and the vice president, after Amendment 12, will be elected as a team, as a group. And it set certain electoral rules for presidential elections. And also rules when Congress elects the president and the vice president. For example, if the president is running for president, remember you need 270 electoral votes to be elected president. That means 270 state votes to be elected president. And the Constitution says it has to be 51%. What if nobody gets 51%? What if 3 people are running? It's hard to get 51% with 3 people running. If no one gets 51% of the electoral vote, that's 270 votes, then the House of Representatives will elect the president, and they can elect anybody they want to. And the Senate will elect the vice president, and they can elect anybody they want to. We would just revert to the system that they use in England and the rest of the world, kind of a parliamentary system where the parliament elects the prime minister. Our Congress would be electing the president. So the Electoral College set up those rules for that situation. Now the Civil War amendments were number 13, which ended slavery, number 14, which is about equal protection and citizenship, and then number 15, which is about black suffrage. These are, I call them the Civil War amendments. 13th Amendment abolished slavery. No slavery or involuntary servitude in the United States. So we can't have any slavery, and we also can't have any involuntary servitude. Well, what is involuntary servitude? They don't talk about it much. But in the 16, 15, 16, 1700s, they used to go in the streets of Dublin and London. They'd pick up teenage boys wandering the streets homeless. They'd put them in handcuffs, put them on ships and send them over to America, and they'd have to serve as slaves. But they didn't call them slaves, they were indentured servants. And they have to stay for, maybe 10 years or so as an indentured service, sometimes 7 years. Wasn't as bad as like for the African Americans, they were there for life. But the indentured service would be there for, say, 7 to 10 years as an involuntary servitude. The 14th Amendment is a very complex and powerful amendment. It has changed the government and our social life a great deal. It's 2 parts to it. First part is about citizenship, and the second part is about equal protection. Let me explain to you how the 14th Amendment came about. After the Civil War, everybody said, well, we need to treat the slaves have to be treated equally. That's what the Republicans in the North were pushing. The Democrats in the South said, no way, we're not going to give up half our society to African American slaves. So when African Americans would go up to vote, for example, they said, you can't vote. Your mother and father were not citizens. They were slaves. So you're not a citizen. In those days, America was just like every other country in the world is today. For you to be a citizen of a country, one of your parents has to be a citizen. Well, the slaves were in an impossible situation because their parents were not citizens, and so they were not citizens. So the Republicans put in the 14th Amendment, and it has two parts to it. The first part is citizenship, and it says if you are born in the United States, you're automatically a citizen. Doesn't matter where your parents were born. If you are born here, you are a citizen. My father was an illegal alien from Germany. He snuck into the country with the intention of getting his brother and sister to come here from Germany. He was not born in the United States. He could never become a citizen. I was born here, so I can become a citizen. Doesn't matter if my father, even if my father was an illegal alien and I was born here, I could become president. Now, the second part of the 14th Amendment talks about equal protection. The law must be applied equally to everyone. That's what it says. But it's a little more complex than that. Let's take a closer look at the equal protection part of the 14th Amendment. The equal protection part of the 14th Amendment, there was a guy named Plessy. He's riding on a train. He's actually, I think he's only 2% African American. There's a picture of him. He's on a train, but it's in the South, and he gets on a train marked for white people. But because he's partly African American, Mr. Plessy sat in the white train car, and he was arrested. You can't sit there. So his case went before the Supreme Court. He argued they were going to put him in jail, and he applied to the state courts, went all through the state courts, got up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court gave a Plessy versus Ferguson decision. It said that separate is okay if it is equal. It's okay for you to have to sit in a black train car. As long as there's a white car and a black car, that's equal. The 14th Amendment says everyone need to be treated equally. Doesn't mean everybody had to be integrated. It just matters you have a black car and a white car. You have a white drinking fountain and a black drinking fountain. It started the Jim Crow laws, where you had people going into the front of the store to get your ice cream, and then people would have to go to the side or the back of the store if you were black. So Plessy Ferguson really initiated what they call the Jim Crow laws. It's a whole set of laws that people followed, and I remember them. I was alive at that time, and I was a younger man, and I remember all this stuff that was going on. So Plessy Ferguson just divided African Americans and white people completely, and it was a difficult obstacle to overcome. So along came one of my real heroes in the world, is Thurgood Marshall. He was a young lawyer, and he knew he had to get rid of Plessy Ferguson if he was going to get the law changed. He wanted to get the schools integrated. So Thurgood Marshall argued Brown versus Board of Education Topeka case before the Supreme Court. He took the case to the Supreme Court. He said, look, judges, you separating these kids, you're really harming them just by separating them. You're making one group inferior to the other group. The Supreme Court agreed that separate cannot be equal. It's not equal. And Thurgood Marshall took some experiments up there that they did with African American kids in the South and dolls and things. The schools must be integrated. That's the Brown decision in Brown versus Board of Education. And the hero that got that pass is Thurgood Marshall. Remember his name. Enough people don't remember him. He eventually later was put on the Supreme Court by Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson. And he served until he died. But he was a great man and a kind man. The 14th Amendment made the Bill of Rights and the other amendments apply to the states as well. This is another very important part of the 14th Amendment, or a consequence of the 14th Amendment. Before the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights only applied to laws written by the U.S. Congress, by the United States laws written by Congress. It did not apply to state laws written by individual states. So Connecticut could make its own religion. Massachusetts could do away with freedom of speech if they wanted to. They didn't have to they didn't have to worry about the Bill of Rights. This is before the 14th Amendment. After the 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment says the laws be applied equal to everybody. So after the 14th Amendment, then the U.S. laws written by Congress had to conform to this Bill of Rights, and laws written by the states had to conform to the Bill of Rights. Remember, the Bill of Rights were a big prohibition on government. It's the greatest anti-government document ever written, are the Bill of Rights, because there are restrictions put on the government telling the government they cannot infringe upon your rights. That's what the Bill of Rights does. They don't give you your rights. You're born with your rights. They're just telling the government to stop messing around with your rights. Now, the 15th Amendment is the third of the Civil War amendments. It was about black suffrage. Suffrage means voting. It said that African American men were given the right to vote. You can't bar someone from voting because of race. And of course, so then it didn't give the right to women. Women were still not allowed to vote. It wasn't until later in the 20th century that they got the right to vote. But African American men, not African American women, got the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. Now, the next group of amendments, I call them the Progressive Era Amendments. And the first of those is the 16th Amendment. As a progressive group began and liberals became a little bit more powerful in the government, they were coming up with programs to help poor people and minorities and things like that. That's what progressives do. And so they needed money with all these programs they're coming up with. So they had to authorize a federal income tax. Before the 16th Amendment, people did not pay taxes. There was no IRS. Just anything you made, you kept in your pay was yours. There was no taxes. But that was the 16th Amendment, brought in the federal income tax was authorized. The 17th Amendment is about the election of senators. Now, before the 17th Amendment, senators were appointed by the state legislatures and by the governors of the states. But the senators but people thought that senators really should be elected by the people in the state. So senators, as a result of the 17th Amendment, senators were now elected by the people, just like members of the House of Representatives are. This picture, it's a good picture, but the people in the newspaper, that's Roosevelt and Thomas Dewey. They're not, but the picture gets the point across. The 18th Amendment, sorry folks, no booze. It was a prohibition, and it was another one of those progressives. Progressives like to improve people's health and make people happy and help people. And they felt that alcohol was harming the people in the United States. I don't think you could probably argue with that. So they brought in prohibition. They said no more booze of any kind. All forms of alcohol are abolished in the United States. That's it. The 19th Amendment finally gave women the right to vote. That's women's suffrage. And I know people talk about the fact that England got the right to vote for women before the United States. But you always have to look at those things a little more closely. England women got the right to vote first, but listen to what you had to do. You had to be over 30 years of age. And you had to be living in a house where there's a man head of household. If you were a single living in, you couldn't vote. So there were really restrictions put on the English women right to vote. In America, women got the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, and you cannot be denied for any reason. And there were no restrictions. As long as you were 21, any woman could vote. Finally, it was a long time coming. And it's one of the best things that have ever happened to politics, is when women finally got the right to vote. Now, the 20th Amendment has to do, it's called the lame duck amendment. It has to do with government power. After Congress and the president are elected, they take office in January instead of March. That's what the 20th Amendment says. So before the 20th Amendment, the president got elected in November, and then in December, he was a lame duck. In January, he was a lame duck. In February, he was a lame duck. What that means is he didn't have any power. He got elected in November. Everybody knows he's leaving office in March, so nobody pays any attention to him. They call him a lame duck. And he's got 3 long months that he is a lame duck. After the 20th Amendment, after they put that constitutional amendment in, then the election was still in November, but only 1 month was he a lame duck because the president took office in January. It shortened up that time when the people didn't pay attention to the president. The 21st Amendment repealed prohibition. All laws have unintended consequences, and nobody foresaw the crime and the corruption and the mafia and the people doing drugs and speakeasies and all that stuff. Nobody knew the crime was going to be introduced into the world because of prohibition. So in the 21st Amendment, they repealed prohibition. They said people can drink again. So the 18th Amendment was out. That's what 21st Amendment did. Now, it repealed the 18th Amendment and made liquor legal again in the United States. But it wasn't a national thing anymore. The states can make their own laws about liquor, alcohol. So the states could do what they wanted to do in regards to alcohol. So every state has different laws. California has different laws for drinking than other states do. At one time in New York, I don't know if it's still that way, you could drink when you're 18. California's 21. The 22nd Amendment talks about term limits for the president. FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, got elected, and he did not follow the principles set down by George Washington, but he didn't have to. George Washington, he got elected for 8 years, 2 terms, 4 years and 4 years. And at the end of those 8 years, everybody wanted to run again. He said, no. Washington said, I'm giving up power. A person shouldn't be president more than 8 years because you can turn into a dictator. So he voluntarily gave up power. Most people in the world would want to become dictators. And Washington could have. They would have made him king if he wanted to be king. So you can only run for president twice. That's what the 22nd Amendment. Because Franklin Roosevelt came in when he got elected. He got elected in 32, where he ran against Herbert Hoover. Then in 36, his next election, he ran against Alf Landon of Kansas, and he beat him. Then in 1940, he ran against Wendell Willkie. I campaigned for Roosevelt in 1940. I was a young kid, but I went around knocking on doors. I had a big Roosevelt button trying to get people to vote for Roosevelt. We had a little saying about Willkie. I can't remember what it was, Dilky Wilkie or something like that. And then in 1944, Roosevelt ran again for president, and he won. And that year, he ran against Thomas Dewey, and I campaigned for Roosevelt then in 1944. Our saying then, I remember what that was "Phooey on Dewey," and we got Roosevelt elected in 1944. Not that Dewey was a bad guy. He was actually a pretty good guy. He broke up the mafia in New York. Reaction against President Franklin Roosevelt's 4 times of breaking the tradition established by George Washington. It didn't go over that well, but George Washington was a great man, but so was Franklin Roosevelt. They just had different ways of looking at this issue. Now, the 22nd Amendment, if the president is a little bit more complicated, if the president dies in office, okay, the vice president can serve up to 2 years of the president's term. So the president, it's called term limits. You can run 2 more times for yourself. Let me explain what that means. A guy can be president for 10 years maximum. Let me illustrate it this way. John F. Kennedy got assassinated, and it was still in his first term. He got assassinated at 63. He was due to run for president again in 64, the next year. Well, the guy that came in his place that took over for him was Vice President Johnson. And Johnson served one of JFK's years, the last year of his term, and he could have run twice himself. He ran in 64 and got reelected, but then in 68 he decided not to run again. This is called term limits for the president. The 23rd Amendment gave voting rights to the people of Washington, D.C. Reason people in Washington, D.C. could not vote for president is because they're not a state. They're not in any state. Washington, D.C. is just a city all by itself. It's not part of any state, so it doesn't have any electoral votes. Remember, the states elect the president in the United States. So Washington, D.C., the people felt they were disenfranchised. They were not getting to vote for president. So the 23rd Amendment gave the people in Washington, D.C. some electoral votes so they can they can vote for president. The 24th Amendment was about poll taxes. Here's another thing they tried to do in the South. They were always trying to disenfranchise. The Democrats in the South were always trying to take advantage of the African Americans and the former slaves. They were so afraid that the African Americans, former slaves, were going to take over the South. So they had all these caveats in there and all these little restrictions. And one of them was the poll tax. They would charge them a tax for you to register or vote. Let me explain to you what it was like. And I remember these days. I was alive when this happened. In the 1960s, I was a bartender. And I would come home with between $3 or $5 of tips at night, and I thought I was making a lot of money. Worked at Coronado, California. I'd come home and give my wife $1 or $2, and she'd go to the grocery store and buy dinner for us. Hamburger, milk, bread, butter. She'd buy a whole bunch of stuff for $2. And then she could cook dinner for us. Now take yourself into the South. The people in the South, most of the African Americans in the South were sharecroppers, poor laborers. And for them to have vote, they were going to have to spend $3 or $4, maybe $5 as a poll tax in order to vote. If you were African American and had a family in the South during those days, would you spend your money to vote or to feed your family? Charging a poll tax really restricted African Americans from voting because they could not afford to spend the money for that. So the 24th Amendment said the states cannot charge a tax for voting or registering to vote. Now, the first time I voted, I had to pay a poll tax. It was $3. But I was not a sharecropper or a laborer. The guy that really pushed the poll tax amendment was President Johnson. A lot of people misunderstand President Johnson. I need to put a plug in for the guy here. When people think of President Johnson, they think of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was not Johnson's war, it was Kennedy's war. Johnson didn't want to be in that war. He did everything he could to get out of it. He just got entangled in it and he couldn't get out. All Johnson cared about was civil rights and helping poor people. But he got stuck with the Vietnam War and it tied down his presidency. Excuse me. Well, thank you, Mr. President, wherever you are. The 25th Amendment is another one of those complicated amendments. It's about presidential disability and succession. Here's what the situation was. It establishes who will take office if the president is disabled or if he dies. In 1963, when John F. Kennedy got assassinated, some people in the United States said this might be a plot by the Russians. You see, because at that time, it was not officially in the Constitution who would take over if the president died. And you had to know who was going to be president right away. And here's why. The president, all the time, you can look at pictures even today, there's a naval officer always by the president that has a briefcase, and the briefcase is handcuffed to this naval officer. He follows the president wherever he goes. President goes to the restroom, he sits in a chair outside the restroom. President goes to bed at night, he sits in a chair outside his bedroom. What's in that briefcase? The launch codes for the intercontinental ballistic missiles. This is at the height of the Cold War. And people were afraid that the Russians assassinated Kennedy so they could attack us. We wouldn't know who the president was right away, and so we would not be able to get the launch codes to attack them back. That's what people thought at the time. Whether it was true or not, I don't know, but that's what people thought. So they came up with a way that who would succeed the president if the president was killed. So here at the top you have the president. If he dies, then the vice president takes over. If the vice president dies, the Speaker of the House takes over. If the vice president dies, then the President pro tem of the Senate, the most senior senator, takes over. So if Trump were to die or get incapacitated somehow, then Mike Pence, the vice president, would take over. But if both of them were out of service, Speaker Pelosi would take over as president of the United States. And then I'm not sure right now who is the president pro tem of the Senate. But the president pro tem of the Senate is next in line to be president. When I worked in Washington, it was right after Kennedy's assassination. And I had a friend, and she was the secretary to the president pro tem of the Senate. At that time, his name was Carl Hayden. So if the vice president and the Speaker of the House, they all died, then Carl Hayden would have become president. After the president pro tem of the Senate, it then goes over to the Secretary of State. But if he dies, then it goes down to the Secretary of the Treasury. And if the Secretary of Treasury, then it goes around the rest of the cabinet one at a time. Each department head will take turns. The only caveat, they have to be born in the United States to do that. The 26th Amendment gave voting rights to 18-year-olds. It said if you're old enough to fight, you're old enough to vote. This came in right in the middle of the Vietnam War. And the guy that pushed it through was Richard Nixon. And thank you, Mr. President. We appreciate it. They said, look, these kids are over there fighting and they can't vote. They're 18 years of age. So that's why you have a right to vote. You guys don't vote all the time. You should take it more seriously. A lot of people sacrifice to give you that right to vote. I know you'd rather be at the beach. Sometimes I would rather be too, but try to take your voting rights and responsibilities a little more seriously. The final amendment to the Constitution is Amendment 27. It has to do with congressional pay. It says that if Congress gives itself a pay raise, it does not take effect until the next congressional session. So if Congress votes themselves to give themselves a pay raise, they can't get it until the next time they're elected. They have to be re-elected before they can start getting the money. And so this led to a big problems for the Democrats. The Democrats just screwed up. They just messed up terrible. What happened was this. This is a weird amendment to the Constitution. It's 1994. For some reason, God knows why, the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate, and they had controlled both houses of Congress for almost 50 years. And they decided to give themselves a pay raise. Well, probably it was justified. I'm not saying that. It cost a lot of money to be in Congress. They gave themselves a 50% pay raise. But we were in a recession, and the American people went ballistic. That is when talk radio got started. Rush Limbaugh and the right-wing talk radio got started this time. It was a reaction against Congress giving themselves that pay raise. So the Congress, the Democrats in Congress, tried very hard to make up for that. So what they did is they said, we'll change the Constitution. So we won't take the money until after we get reelected. And I actually went back into the archives and found an old amendment that had been proposed in the 1700s by 2/3 of both houses of Congress, but they never went out to the states for ratification. They pulled out that amendment, sent it out to the states to get ratified, and it was ratified. But it's not an amendment that has a lot of meaning, really, to be honest with you, except that Congress can't. But I'm sure they'll find other ways to get around it. I don't want you to look down on congressmen. It costs a lot of money to run for Congress and to be in Congress. So those are the 27 amendments to the Constitution. I want to thank you. You're a great class, and I miss you, and I wish we were in school again. Thank you.